So you'll know me by now. I'm Claire, I'm the Outreach Director, and I'm very excited to bring you these three wonderful people this morning. It's still morning? Yes. They're contributors to this book, West Wingers, stories from the dream chasers, change makers, and hope creators inside the Obama White House. Remember the Obama White House? It's a collection of essays from exactly what it says, people who worked inside the Obama White House and effected all kinds of exciting change that we probably threw parties about and celebrated about and drank champagne over and things like that. So yeah, very excited to have them with us. Gautam Raghavan is the editor of the book. He's a big West Wing fan. We were just having a conversation, apparently these people all want to be CJ, so...
Who doesn't want to be
CJ? Well, I kind of want to be Donna, but, you know, that's because of the Josh thing, so... They have higher goals than me in mind. Gautam was the Associate Director of Public Engagement under President Obama, acting as liaison to both the LGBT and Asian American and Pacific Islander communities, which sounds like a lot to me, but... and he's brought with him two of his contributors. So Stephanie Valencia on my right was the Special Assistant to the President. These titles are very long. Special Assistant to the President and Principal Deputy Director of Public Engagement. We'll talk about what that all means. Overseeing critical engagement programs like Champions of Change and the Community Leaders Briefing Series. Over on my left is Lynn Rosenthal, who served as the first ever White House advisor on violence against women from 2009 to 2014, and she now works in a similar role for the Biden Foundation. So, Gautam, could you start by telling us a bit about the impetus behind this book and what inspired it?
Sure. So, a lot of it really does come back to the West Wing. Not just the title, which is an obvious reference, but as I write in the preface of the book, in college, when I was first becoming politically active, I was a huge West Wing fan. And so for me, when I eventually found myself in the Obama White House, I found a lot of parallels between what I saw on TV and what I was living in real life. It was perhaps a little less glamorous, not so many walk and talks, more memos. Longer hours, but the sort of the essence of it was the same, right? You had obviously this sort of brilliant professor in chief. You had a sort of a cast of characters around him who worked for him, people who came from every walk of life, who cared deeply about the work that they were doing. And so I think if you ask any of us, the thing that we missed the most about working in the White House was the people, the amazing people we got to work with. And so I've been sort of mulling over, what is the best way that we can capture that sense of the Obama White House? And then really what happened was after the election, it was actually a New Year's Eve party at Stephanie's house, and we were in the kitchen having Manhattans or old fashions? There was bourbon.
These are important details.
Yes, they're very important details. And, kind of feeling a little bad about the state of affairs, about the election and what had happened, and both a sense of nostalgia that we're about to lose something really special, and a little bit of apprehension, which has now turned into a lot of apprehension, about what we were heading into. And so Stephanie's best friend from college was there, and we got to talking, and I said, "Oh, what do you do?" And she said, "I'm a book agent." And I was like, "Oh, cool." And she said, "Do you have any great ideas for a book?" And I'm like, "Nah." And my husband actually pitched her on the spot and said, "Actually, he's got this great idea about a collection of stories from the Obama White House." And she was like, "Oh, that's a great idea." I'm like, "You're just it's just the bourbon talking." But she followed up and said, "I really think that there's a market for this. I think there's interest, and so you should think about doing this." And so that led to this project. Mm-hmm. We started thinking about who are the people whose stories we want to lift up, and made a list of about 60 people, and then started working our way down the list. And everyone, Lynn, Steffi, and 15 other people said yes. And so that's what you have in front of you, or you don't have in front of you. Hopefully you do, but you will when you buy it. Have in front of you is this collection that really reflects, a broad range of issues over 8 years, events, everything from really, happy stories about marriage equality, some of the behind the scenes around Obamacare and how that came to happen, and then some really hard stuff, a lot of disappointments, a lot of the personal things that people went through. But again, it really reflects what those 8 years were like.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Stephanie, one of your proudest accomplishments was getting Sonia Sotomayor confirmed to the Supreme Court. That's deserving of applause, especially in this horrible week. Could you tell us a bit about what that was like and the challenges and how big a deal it was that you managed to achieve it?
Well, I have been spending a lot of time reflecting on that period the last few weeks. I think it just really goes to show, I mean, when we were in it, and it was really hard, right? Like, there were moments where, even though it was the president's first Supreme Court pick, it was early in his term, we felt like we had the wind at our back. There were still a lot of headwinds we had to face. Congressional Republicans had said, a few months prior that they were going to do everything they could to stop the president's agenda. They were holding up health care. They were holding up, the economic recovery stuff we were trying to do, and they were going to make it really, really hard to confirm Justice Sotomayor. But you rewind back there, and I've been thinking about, what were, the hardest moments of that? It was when they said that she had given that Wise Latina speech and tried to rake her over the coals for that. And then we're raking her over the coals for having diabetes and, her personal health issues. I'm in stark contrast, that was, the worst that they could possibly come up with. And, to this day, and I write my chapter about what it meant to, one, meet her, and I talk about kind of meeting her for the first time. I'm from New Mexico. I'm a Latina who grew up on a border town who had, faced very similar kind of struggles to succeed in my academic life and in my professional life, and kind of the parallels between her life and mine, and how we had this kind of meeting at in the White House at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, and what it took to get her through her confirmation, and the criticisms that she faced by Republicans who didn't even know how to say her name properly, to the sweet success of when we did get her confirmed, and what that felt like, both for me as a young Latina who saw her as a role model, but also for our community broadly, but for the country, and what it really meant to have her voice, somebody just so real who came from the streets of the Bronx, and who just had this different view of reality. And it was something the president had always said that he wanted in a Supreme Court justice, was proximation to reality and real people's lives, and that was such an important ingredient. All the constitutional stuff was really important, the academic credentials, the judicial credentials, which she had all, but what she had was that proximate reality. And I think that, as I look back at her opinions over the last almost 10 years now, and especially in this moment when we're, fighting tooth and nail to protect the Supreme Court, it really just reminds you how important it is to have people like her on the Supreme Court.
And is proximate reality also part of why it's important to have not just white men on the Supreme Court?
I think that is proximate reality, because I talk a lot about how, the experiences that she brought growing up in the Bronx, growing up as a Latina, growing up as a woman, just everybody has different experiences, and we all bring those experiences to any job or any place, decision-making place that we're at. And so having people with those different diverse experiences, it's not just about, checking a box and having somebody Hispanic or African American. It's about the experiences they bring through that view of life and experiencing the world, that's really, really important. And so that is why, yes, it is important to have diversity of all kinds and all places.
Thank you. And something else I want to ask you about is you also worked on the Obama campaign, which campaigns look very glamorous on the West Wing. I'm sure they're not quite that glamorous in
Yeah,
real
definitely
life.
not.
And you were actually just telling me a fun story from the Obama campaign, so I was wondering if these guys would enjoy hearing that.
So if you remember back to 2008, it was a hard-fought primary with President Obama and Secretary Clinton at the time. And we had a hard time after the primaries were over in June to kind of reunite all of her supporters with Obama supporters. And there were some very high-profile events that we did to try to, publicly do that. And I was in charge of one of the first big major events, the first big major event that then candidate Obama did with President Bill Clinton. It was the first event that he was going to do in support of Barack Obama publicly, but also President Santos, Jimmy Smits. It was in Orlando, Florida, and I remember having, part of my job was having to work with these surrogates and helping them, recruiting them to participate in events and helping them, successfully participate. And I swear, Jimmy Smits was acting as if he were actually a president and insisted being on stage with the other two presidents. There's a lot of protocol, and I actually had to tell his agent, you realize like he was not actually president. Nobody actually voted for him in real life. So there was a lot of protocol that I had and pushback I had to do because President Clinton's team and at the time, Senator Obama's team wanted to have Clinton and Obama on stage at the same time because that was a really important message to send to all of the Clinton supporters that we were together. And so I had to gracefully encourage President Santos to leave the stage after he introduced President Clinton. So.
But you were successful?
I was successful.
Great. And is the buzz of the campaign something you miss or something you wouldn't go back to if they paid you $1 million?
I'm way too old to do it now. I mean, I think, being in the White House and being on campaigns is like dog years, and that really is not reflected in the West Wing. Yeah. You really get a lot of gray hair and lose a lot of sleep, and it's a very, very high stress environment. So for me, I'd have to be really, really excited about a candidate. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And Lynn, you had actually left DC when you got a call from the White House asking you if you'd be interested in a job. Can you tell us a bit about that and why you had left DC?
Oh, I actually don't write about this in the book, but it's something I talk to a lot of students and interns about. Is I was the head of the National Network to End Domestic Violence, and I lobbied a lot in Congress, and that's how I knew Joe Biden, who's sort of my mentor and the person who brought me into the White House. So I testified a lot in the Senate Judiciary Committee on the Violence Against Women Act. That's how I knew him. Thank you. But I actually left DC for very personal reasons, and I think it's interesting about all of our lives. I left DC because my mother was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer, and she lived in Miami, and I wanted to be a part of her life. I'd been gone for 20 years, so I don't write about that in the book, but so I left for personal and family reasons, never regretted it, even though I kind of left at what that time was the peak of my career. But, every family decides those things for themselves. Everyone in this room has faced that or will face that, and what you're willing to give up for your family. So I made that decision and left my job as the head of the National Network to End Domestic Violence. But because I went back to work at the local and state level after doing national work, when it came time for Joe Biden to reach out to me, I had a very good experience of work at the local level that I was able to bring. So he was much more interested in our interview in the West Wing. He was much more interested in what I had done in Florida and New Mexico than what I had done in DC previously, because that told him that I had experience on the front lines. So he asked me, Stuart, what are survivors of violence and what are advocates facing in a local shelter program, was much more interesting to him than whatever the battle in Congress had been right before I left DC.
Thank you. And you write in the book of how you and your team were working very hard on this whole issue of violence against women, and yet you still found that people were coming to the White House to protest, essentially, and shout at you and tell you weren't doing a good enough job. But that ended up having positive consequences. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, it's fantastic in retrospect, but it was painful at the time. So, I was probably among the most unlikely people to ever be in the White House. I mean, I was a feminist activist. I write in the book about how I was one of those people who camped out in abortion clinics back in the 80s to keep them from being bombed. I mean, I'm like an on the barricades person. So I was truly among the most unlikely people to be in the White House. And I had been such an activist, and I came up in the feminist movement after my work in abortion rights. I worked in the battered women's movement. That's what we called it at the time. And so I knew how to do all of that. I was very much part of a movement of protest and outrage and fighting. And then I was in the White House with all this institutional power, and I really didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to think in that way. Oh, okay, now we have the reins. We can actually do something. And we started working on the issue of campus sexual assault in 2011. So it was before the student protest movement really emerged on college campuses. And it was part of our look. The vice president had us working on the high rates of dating violence and sexual assault that teens and young adults experience. And a part of that, he had us looking at Title IX and what Title IX as a law addressing gender equality could mean to combating sexual violence in schools. And so we were working on that steadily, and there was a brilliant woman who I don't know if anybody who has ever met her would know of, but her name is Ruslan Ali, and she was the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights in the Department of Education in the early Obama years. Just a stunningly brilliant civil rights lawyer. And she was also working on this issue on Title IX and how we could use this civil rights and education law to combat sexual violence. So that was all happening, and we in 2011, with very little fanfare, actually released the guidance that's become this sort of flashpoint for, in large part, the academic right. So we released this guidance that told colleges and K through 12 schools what they needed to do to address sexual violence, that they needed to have policies and protocols, that they needed to provide a process in looking at these cases that was fair to both students, that they needed to provide education and training for faculty and staff. So we had done all that, and it's just as wonky as it sounds. It was very in the weeds of federal policy. Well, in the meantime, students were still experiencing these terrible sexual assaults, and their schools were responding very, very poorly. And so they got the ear of the media, and there was really the rise of the student protest movement and corresponded with these times. And so one of the things they decided to do was picket the Obama administration for what they perceived was a lack of action on sexual assault on college campuses. But here I had been spending literally night and day for 2 years working, and that's what you don't know about the White House, is most of it is not glamorous. It takes a long time for it to get to the president's level and for you to have that kind of briefing. And so I'd been steadily working like in the weeds of this policy and this guidance, and suddenly we were being picketed. So I had to go. I read about the picket thinking, oh, a picket. And I saw it was against us. It was at the Department of Education. And, you know, I have picketed a lot, but I had never been picketed. So I didn't know what to do. I was really devastated by it. And I went to talk to Valerie Jarrett and Tina Chin, who are leading the White House Council on Women and Girls. And Valerie is the one who said, and I write about this in the book, well, invite them in to talk to us. And I think what we came to understand about each other later is I was such a strong ally for them on the inside. And I would have liked for the students to have done a bit more research on sort of cultivating me as an ally on the inside. They could still come picking and scream and yell at us, but what they needed to understand is there was somebody like me who could really further the agenda. So we came to understand that later on, but it was tough. And they came in and yelled at us for hours at a time about our lack of response. And as I was trying to explain everything I was doing, it sounded slow and bureaucratic. But ultimately led to a lot of success on college campuses.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Gautam, coming back to you, so you're the Associate Director of Public Engagement under President Obama. Could you tell us exactly what that means and also some of your proudest accomplishments?
Sure. So, one of the things that very early in the Obama White House, and Stephanie was there for a lot of this, is this office used to be called the Office of Public Liaison. In fact, it's now called that again. That's apparently the Republican preference is to call it that. But there was a very active effort to rename it the Office of Public Engagement, right? To really, as we would talk about it, be the front door to the White House for communities around the country. And so this was, Valerie Jarrett's shop. She's senior advisor to the president, a longtime friend and mentor of both President and Mrs. Obama. And so we, in a lot of ways, it elevated the importance of this office and its function, which was to hear from every community. So each of us had our own portfolios. There was like a team of about, 20 of us or so. With our own portfolios, whether it was, as I had with the LGBTQ community and the Asian American community, there's Latino, African American, Native American, and then, of course, other communities like veterans, the Jewish American community, Muslim American community, women, basically every part of America was somehow represented in this office. And so, most of us saw our jobs as basically having two functions, right? One was to be a voice for the president to these communities. So to be able to tell, for example, LGBTQ community leaders why the Jobs Act matters to them, which on the surface, it may not feel like it does. And then the second part was to be a voice for those communities, as Lynn was too, within the White House and within the decision-making apparatus. And this really goes back to what you were talking about earlier with Stephanie about the importance of, we tend to get caught up in these buzzwords like, identity politics or diversity inclusion, but it really is about what the positive impact of having representation and inclusion when you're making decisions, right? We used to say in the White House, people are a policy, which is meant to really encapsulate that idea, right? That when you have the broad experiences of Americans reflected in the decision-making process, you get better outcomes for them.
Great, thank you. And this is kind of a rough question to ask, but I think that it needs to be asked, is how much of what you all worked on is now under threat, and what can we do about it other than for those of you who can vote in the midterms, call our representatives, but what else can we do?
A lot of it, unfortunately, is under threat. I mean, there are things, legislatively, there are things that are hard to undo, right? It will be hard for them to reinstate Don't Ask, Don't Tell, but obviously, the president sort of tweets about his efforts to ban transgender people from serving in the military, which so far, thanks to the courts, has not been completely successful. They're not going to, all of a sudden, find a way to ban marriage equality, although they can chip away at the edges of it. A lot of the regulatory stuff, I mean, this is so wonky, right? But a lot of the things that we all worked on, whether it was DACA or some of the Title IX guidance to schools, that stuff has been undone, or they're trying to undo it. So it is, and unfortunately, throughout this whole process, we don't have a Congress that's willing to exercise any kind of oversight or be a check on power. So I think voting is very important. But I think also we have to be very vigilant. And especially when I talk to, for example, folks in the LGBTQ community, we made a whole lot of progress over the last decade. But if we've learned anything from the history of civil rights in this country, is that you can't just sort of sit on that progress. People will try to undo it, as they have done with voting rights and civil rights and women's rights over the decades. So I don't know if you guys want to add anything, but unfortunately we do have a lot to worry about.
Another piece, and all of my work has been under attack, either from apathy or direct hostility with the Secretary of Education and undoing the Title IX guidance. And we will see, many college campuses will continue to engage in best practices, and they've told us that once they had a hard time making the leap, but once they did it, they see the benefits of it. So I think that some of that will continue. The other issue that we're not talking about that much is really the impact of this administration on the civil service, and some of you, that may mean some of the people in this room, but I know people who've worked in the federal government who are experts on their issues, who've been there for 20 years, who weathered all the Bush years. They can't do it. They can't stay. And so the brain drain out of the civil service, and those are the people who actually know their issues, and the brain drain out of the civil service, I think, is tremendous. It's been reported on at the State Department, but it's true. I know people in the Justice Department who did excellent work on victims' rights forever who are no longer there, so in part because what things that they were directed to do. So I think that's going to have an effect on the country for a long time to come. There's a guy this is a positive story, and I think he would stay to the end of forever. But there's a guy in the Department of Education who is a career service guy who is an expert on sexual assault on college campuses. He's an expert on something called the Clery Act, which is legislation that governs that as well as Title IX. And I invited him to the White House Task Force to Protect Students from Sexual Assault, which was usually run at a higher level. It was like the assistant secretary level. And I invited him because I knew he knew what he was talking about, and I sat him at the table with all of these other political officials. And he opened his mouth, and we learned more in 10 minutes than we had learned in months, because this guy had been waiting, obviously, 20 years for somebody to ask him what he knew. And there are people like him throughout the federal government, and it's important that they feel supported and to stay in their jobs and do the work they do so well.
The two things I would just add super quickly: everything I worked on is completely under attack. I worked on immigration too, so that's obviously hugely under attack every single day, and have lots of friends, who are on the threat of and being threatened to be deported. One is, I think, one of the things we kind of underestimate or underappreciate about, there's all the kind of legislative policy things that are under attack, but I think Lynn alluded to this, which is the institutional attacks, the attack on the institutions of democracy. And, I was talking to somebody about this last night, about how, if Judge Kavanaugh is in fact lying under oath, what that means to the act of taking an oath now, how that actually, the permanent damage that leaves to really important institutions that we have. I think is something that we kind of take for granted because we think they're just rules and things like that, but as soon as they're broken and breached, like it takes a toll on our democracy and the democratic institutions. And then just on the point of voting, I would say you should not just vote, but like every person in this room should make sure 5 people in their network are registered to vote and actually vote and make a plan to vote, and that you're helping them make those plans to vote. If they're going to be out of town, request their absentee ballot, help them turn it in. So like if every person in this room got 5 people, there are probably 75 people here right now. Whatever 75 times 5 is, I was never that great at math. That's a lot of votes.
Yeah.
How many?
That was fast.
Good.
Sounds about right.
Yeah, that's right.
The other thing I just would add, because I am kind of passionate about this topic, is that so much of governing is not the things that you hear about on the news or even read about in social media. Like in each of our issue areas, there were hundreds of actions that happened administratively through guidance or letters, and they don't rise to the level that you're going to hear about. One I think about is that we did some work with Head Start programs, and we sent a letter to all Head Start programs around the country about domestic violence and its effects on children, and what you could do as a Head Start teacher or worker if you saw kids in your classroom. Well, nobody's ever going to hear about that, right? But it's going to make a difference to some kid in some school somewhere. And all of that, I think most of that work has pretty much ground to a halt. Like that kind of proactive engagement on issues that could make the country better is really not happening.
So that's all, sorry, because I did take us there, a little depressing, but I'm going to bring us back round to the fact that hope and change. Hope was a big, motto and theme of the Obama administration, and actually also of the Santos administration. In fact, the speech that Bradley Whitford wrote for Jimmy Smits declaring his candidacy was all about hope. As I'm sure you can probably all recite it verbatim. But yeah, so sorry, little tangent just to get the words Bradley Whitford into this conversation. But also to get the word hope, which is where I was going. And in fact, it's on the cover.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, when you are thinking about all the depressing things happening in the news, when you're meeting with people who have heartbreaking stories, when you're thinking about your hard work being under threat, where do you go to renew your hope? Is it whether that is to things in real life or to... Do you watch The West Wing to rev yourself up about? Is there certain music? Are there certain books? Where do you go to so that you feel like you can keep fighting another day?
You start, Gautam. I need to
as I told you earlier, I was feeling so crappy earlier this week. I watched The Supremes. I'm like, there's, Glenn Close. He is not Christopher Mulready, though. I'll tell you that.
No, he's not.
So and a lot of this actually, writing and editing and putting this book together has been, weirdly enough, a hopeful exercise. And I say weirdly because it started off as a very nostalgic thing, right? We were feeling bad, we were feeling sad, we were feeling like we were losing something. But when it's all said and done, I try to remind myself all the time that we never stopped being the country that elected Barack Obama twice, right? So those people are still out there, those voters are still out there. It's still a thing that happened in big ways. And all the people who are in this book and the hundreds, the thousands of people who are not in this book, who campaigned for him, knocked on doors, who worked in the administration, we didn't go anywhere either, right? So there are still people out there who care deeply about this country, about our democratic norms, about patriotism, and all this idealism that we just don't see or talk about anymore. And they're making change in different ways. So whether it's in philanthropy, in the private sector, people running for office now, which is amazing. And I'll sort of end on that, which is I think one of the things that makes me very hopeful is seeing the enthusiasm and energy in the candidates out there, right? Because one of our former colleagues who's in this book, Michael Strautmanis, who has known the president and first lady for 30 years, he said something to me after the election, actually to a lot of us, and said, we have to stop asking Barack and Michelle Obama to save the world. The point being that they've done enough, right? Give them a break. And so, although it's nice to see him on the campaign trail and talking, just talking, oh my God, an adult talking, it's just so refreshing. I mean, using words, complete sentences. Even though it's so reassuring to want more of that, we have to find that leadership somewhere else. And if you look at some of the amazing, especially women of color who are running this cycle, who are just phenomenal. So I think that's where I find some hope, is just this new cohort of leadership that is answering President Obama's call to service.
I just say this book couldn't have come at a better time, I think, both for my own mental health and also I think for that of everybody that we talked to. So like, you know, I think just it was very therapeutic to write the chapter that I wrote because I hadn't really spent a bunch of time like reflecting on my time in the administration, and it really, you know, pushed me to think about what did I learn, what were my takeaways, and kind of how did it change me as a human being, how did it change my soul. And so doing that was really, really therapeutic. But I also think like now doing the book tour and doing events like this gives me hope to kind of talk about it, at least leave reality for like an hour and talk about the past. But you know, I think the way I kind of channel my frustration is I'm, you know, just throwing myself even more into the causes, into the things that I care about to try to kind of rewrite the course of history and, you know, encourage people and the next generation of leaders to give them the tools to step up and encourage them to take leadership. Because I think for a lot of people, as Gautam said, we're all waiting for, you know, the president and first lady to keep saving us, right? And at a certain point, we had to kind of step into those roles and encourage people around us and behind us to step into that too. And so, you know, along with Gautam, I think, you know, that role of what our role is now to kind of bring people up behind us and is probably where I get my inspiration as well.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, I find a lot of hope in the youth movement today. One of the things we're doing at the Biden Foundation is going around the country, and we're meeting with groups of teenagers to talk about their ideas for ending gender-based violence. And they're quite interesting. They're very bold in what they want to do. You know, young men now have a language that they never had before to talk about these issues, and I'm very heartened as I listen to them talk about their commitment to ending violence against women. So I find a lot of hope in the youth movement today at all levels, and what teenagers are doing, really, they're making connections between issues. So we talked to a lot of the young people involved in the anti-gun movement today, and they're linking up their work with gender-based violence with other kinds of issues. And so I think there's a generation of thinkers that are going to really be change makers themselves. So I find a lot of hope. And then I go out in my garden and I, you know, grow tomatoes.
Yeah, I think that's also important. We need to eat, right? What are some of the other stories in the book?
Sure. Let me just give you a couple that I think are particularly interesting, in addition to, obviously, Lynn and Stephanie's. One is our colleague Brad Jenkins, who was the liaison to basically the creative community, Hollywood types. And he writes about, did folks here see the Between Two Ferns video with President Obama? Remember healthcare.gov? It didn't go so well. And so the aftermath of that, there was a real need to get people to go to healthcare.gov, sign up for healthcare, especially young men who all the research shows are the worst about this. And so, you know, he writes about that sequence of events that led to filming Between Two Ferns with the president and like the day of that whole story. My story is about the president's evolution on marriage equality, so it's very much like my story and what it was like to be a married gay staffer, like watching that whole thing unfold. Not always easy. You know, the president's videographer, Hope Hall, she's got this like sort of like 1960s like sort of Jack Kerouac kind of way of writing about it, but she writes about mindfulness and learning how to be centered in the calm of the storm, and she learned that from President Obama from behind the camera, which is a very cool story. Our colleague Heather Foster writes about the day of the Charleston funeral service. In fact, the whole sequence of events from the shooting to the day that the president took the stage and sang Amazing Grace.
Cecilia Munoz talks about immigration from the inside, and you know, being similar to what Lynn talked about, she'd been a long-time advocate on immigration reform. On the outside, you know, the president kind of harassed her into serving, and she couldn't say no. And then kind of coming into government, and quite frankly, being criticized by a lot of people who she had worked alongside with for 20 years for people not feeling like we had done enough on immigration. But talks a lot about like the inside path and kind of history around immigration.
And I can't. How could I forget this? Our colleague Leah Katz-Hernandez, the name of her chapter is Imagine Joey Lucas.
Yeah.
I was hoping you were going to go there.
I was like, how did I forget that? That's true. So Leah's a deaf woman, and she it's a cool story because she writes about how when she was a kid, like people would be like, oh, you could be like Joey Lucas, because she was interested in politics, and how she worked her way up from the campaign to the White House and was the West Wing receptionist, which is the first. Literally, the title is Receptionist of the United States, ROTUS. The first person you see when you walk through the door, whether you're a senator or a celebrity. And what that was like for her, and what was like for people for their first experience of the West Wing to be a deaf woman, and then the actual day that Marlee Matlin came to the White House and what it was like for her to thank her from the stage, which is a very cool story. So now you have no excuse not to buy the book.
The one thing I will say, which is very cool, and for those of you who are riding planes or have long drives back, it is available on Audible, and each of the authors reads them themselves.
Yeah.
So that each reads their own chapter.
There we go. Yeah, we don't have it for sale today. I'm really sorry. I did try and warn you all yesterday to buy it, and I know that lots of you did, but it is available on all the ebook platforms and obviously from your local wonderful independent bookshops who you definitely should support, especially East City Books who are here this weekend. Just a quick plug. I'm going to open it up for questions. We don't have a roving mic, so I'm going to have to slightly repeat you. We do have a roving mic. Amazing.
Two.
We may not have time for everyone, just heads up, and try and keep your questions short. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a sort of looking back. I have a looking back question. Maybe I don't need to use this. And that is, there's often been criticism, whether fair or not, that there wasn't enough selling to the American people of Obamacare back in 2010, 2011, what it meant for the American family, why they should think it important. I'd like to get anybody that was involved in that issue, get your take on that, looking back. Could more have been done, et cetera, with regard to that issue?
Yeah.
I'll start, because I was really involved in that part, and then also like in the implementation of Obamacare. Not the website not working, but trying to build that excitement and awareness around signing up. I think that we tried. I think there was a lot of effort put into trying to tell that story. I actually remember being in a meeting with President Obama where he talked about, where we were talking, it was in the midst of the debate, and we were whipping votes and trying to figure out where we needed to put pressure and get some of the groups that we were working with on the outside to be putting pressure on members of Congress. And I remember the president saying something, and paraphrasing here, but like something along the lines of, people are, this is a risky vote, I understand, but like in 10 years, we're going to look back and people are going to not be able to take this away from them. The minute we give the healthcare to people, like they're not going to be able to take it away. And I remember, there were a lot of really hard votes. People like Tom Perriello in Virginia lost their seat because of the vote on healthcare. And I think as much as we had possibly tried to tell an even stronger story, the media wanted to write this narrative about Republican versus Democrat, and weren't really kind of telling the full narrative and story about like the impact, because it was also really hard to make tangible when it was still a policy, right? And so now that we have seen, and now that we actually have stories of people whose lives have been saved because of it, or who have been able to get health care when they otherwise would not have been able to, either because of lifetime limits or pre-existing conditions or any number of things, we have those faces to associate it with it now, and that is why every attempt to repeal it has failed. And you look back and people are like running on healthcare in 2018 and preserving healthcare, when in 2010 people were running as far away as they could from it.
There's more that could have been done at the time, I guess.
Yeah, certainly I think there probably could have been, but I think we were really trying hard to do that. I think there was just a lack of appetite to tell that story beyond. I mean, like, everybody says, like, oh, the president should have just talked about it more. Like, I could probably give the countless number of speeches, like he probably gave over 100 speeches on healthcare. Like sometimes it just wouldn't get picked up, or it just wasn't as resonant, or for whatever reason didn't go viral in the same ways. We didn't like have a viral button or something that like could make, certain things went viral that we never expected, and then certain things that we thought would get a lot more pickup didn't get pickup. And so I think for us, like, I remember just there were times it was like, we can't talk about anything but healthcare. Like we would try to get him to shift to other topics, and it was like only we could talk about healthcare. So I think we did try. I think we were just in a really challenging environment to get our message out there.
Okay, next question.
Hi, so thank you for coming. Obviously, we all understand there is a difference between television and reality, but I was wondering if you could speak to what is the biggest or most significant thing the show got right, and biggest or most significant thing the show got wrong.
Oh yeah. I mean, in a lot of ways, I'm sure this has been talked about to death, but like there were so many weird parallels, like Obama, Matt Santos, like all that stuff, right? And there are plot lines in the show that like did happen. Like that, I think that some of the politics they got right, and I think the look for me at least personally, I think the soaring idealism, like that, the feeling of walking into the White House, like that. Absolutely, they nailed it, right? I think it's really the execution, the day-to-day work. The West Wing did not look like that. It's a lot smaller and more crowded, and fewer people work in the West Wing. All of us didn't have offices in the West Wing. We'd be there for meetings, but we were all like right across the street in the Eisenhower Executive Office Building. So the day-to-day was not like that. It was way less glamorous.
Less flirting or about the same amount of flirting?
Flirting?
Less flirting, right?
Less.
Less.
There were definitely
There were a
fewer
couple.
romantic relationships in our West Wing,
Yeah,
I think.
that's right.
There were a couple, but.
I mean,
Yeah.
who had time, really? Like, one of my favorite moments is I always felt like I'm totally falling apart and my hair's flying, and I'm lucky I got dressed that morning because I went to bed at 2 in the morning or whatever, and I was in the van one time with the vice president's communication staff, and I looked down, and his press secretary's shoe was held together by tape. And I was like, oh, thank God. It's not just, I mean, the day-to-day grueling life is just not, who has time to look that pulled together? And the other thing is the cast of thousands, there's a cast of thousands, and the policy process is grinding and slow, and that's just not reflected in the show.
No, I mean, it wouldn't be that interesting to watch
Right,
every
right, exactly. So,
Next question.
This is kind of along those lines. I was talking to a staffer for Senator Carper, and I said I was a West Wing fan. And he said, yeah, people come in thinking it's a West Wing, but it ends up being more like Veep.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you had some humorous, like that, anecdotes that you'd like to share.
Oh my God, everyone knows a Jonah, right? Like seriously, yes. It is a lot. I mean, in a lot of ways, the day-to-day felt more like Veep, just because Veep, I think, captures the sort of people, like the people nature, right? The heart of who people are. And you get that, obviously, in the White House staff. It's definitely nothing like House of Cards or Scandal, although these days maybe it is. Yeah, I mean, there are like just weird moments that, like when you're staffing a principal, like when you're with the president or the vice president or Valerie or one of our bosses, and you're shadowing them, like trying to remind them who someone is before they meet them, like sort of remember. Like I still do that. We still do that with the VP sometimes. So that part is is closer. Yeah. What, you got any funny stories? They're safe for work.
not tellable.
Yeah, I know, that's the problem.
They're not
Yeah.
tellable.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there are definitely like those moments where you're like, you're preparing for the moment, whether it's the cameras coming in and there's like a scramble like right before to like make sure everybody's set, or to like make sure that, grab the like last person and put him here and there, and you're like just kind of holding your breath to make sure like it doesn't all fall apart in front of the press. And there were lots of moments too, this isn't as funny, but like lots of moments that were really behind the scenes, again, these moments that, of what the president's allies coming to hold him accountable, and they were really hard to be a part of. And those were kind of the moments that were probably in the West Wing itself, where, you've got these like really challenging meetings where you have to kind of come to agreement either on a policy or try to convince people what you're trying to do your best. And those were like those moments that were really private but really, really intense, and like were a lot of preparation to get to them. And sometimes you were trying to get a policy outcome to move the ball down the road, or you were trying to get people to not criticize the president publicly afterwards and having to make sure that they actually didn't do it.
Okay. One or two more questions.
I know you mentioned a minute ago about how you try to get the policy focus out there, and you end up stuck on the horse race, the tweets. Okay, the horse race, the tweets, anything but actual substance. How do we get more actual policy discussion back into our discourse? And is there anything as consumers of media that we can do to help get us there?
Great question.
Tough question. I think a lot of what it comes down to are being smart consumers of news and media, and making sure that you are reflecting the appetite for more substance in what you're reading, and that you're supporting the news brands, whether it's a Vox or a Slate or whatever that is actually trying to give you substance. I think there are a lot of really great podcasts out there that are giving you substance to know the facts. I think there's nothing we can possibly do to change Donald Trump in the White House to make sure they're more substantive. We just have to know our facts and know that be able to fact check him and be able to arm ourselves with the facts around what we know to be true and what we know, because he's going to say something 99.9% of it's not going to be true. And so as a universe, we have to be able to call out what's not true and support the people who are trying to put the facts out there, either by tweeting, sharing, but then also through subscription services, making sure they have the resources to be able to keep doing that reporting that will keep folks accountable.
I will say that I think we're seeing some really great journalism now, right? We're in this period of time where even though the press is under attack, we're seeing that. And the broader point, though, is we often talk about how President Obama had to spend the first year or 2 years cleaning up the economic crisis, the economic mess. I think the next president, regardless of whoever she or he is going to have a similar problem in terms of cleaning up these sort of this democratic process mess that has been created, and restoring some integrity to the office of the presidency.
The one last thing I will say, which is just a quick short plug outside of the book, but in January, another former colleague of ours, and I are coming out with a podcast called Finding 46, which is about finding the 46th president, what it will take to beat Donald Trump.
Exciting.
So not ready for download yet, but keep an eye out for it, because we are going to tackle the questions of what does it take to beat Donald Trump in a presidential election? Is that the same as being a good president? And what are the other kind of lessons learned? We'll interview people like Gautam and Valerie Jarrett and others who are very familiar with both the campaign side of things, but also what it takes to run a good White House and what we'll have to do in January 2020.
Sounds
21.
great.
Any further
I'm a believer in local coalition building, and social media activism has its place, and it's a strong place for mobilizing, but it's not a place for well-informed discourse. And so I think as you start meeting in coalition, going back to what we've seen here in Montgomery County, it's happening in PG County where I live as well, where there's local mobilizations where people are having real conversations. But I think those real conversations then can bleed into the social media environment as people talk in a well-informed way and not just repeat the latest thing they read on some blog from somebody who has no idea what they're talking about. So I think becoming better informed citizens and going back to some of the more old-fashioned means of advocacy could also help build bridges to the environment today.
Okay, one last question.
There was a scene with Toby Ziegler. We brought everybody together, and he said, "You're my guys. Make the victories easier and the defeats. The victories better and the defeats easier." Was that? Did you have those experiences in the White House? And also, what was your biggest win and what was your biggest defeat as a team?
I'll start, because this is a story Gautam and I like to tell together, which is, some of the best days in the White House for some of us were some of the hardest days for others. And there is a very specific moment that I like to talk about, which was in December of 2010. We had been working kind of on two parallel tracks to pass two really important pieces of legislation, Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and the DREAM Act. And through the Senate, and it was right before the last push before the holiday break. So I think it was December 19th, I want to say. And it was a Saturday morning, and both of those pieces of legislation were up for a cloture vote in the Senate, which meant they needed 60 votes, which meant we needed all Democrats and a few Republicans to vote for it. And Don't Ask, Don't Tell went first, if I recall, and passed with a good number, more than 60 votes. And then the DREAM Act was up for a vote and fell short. And so you had in the gallery, as Gautam likes to talk about, both, active duty service members who would benefit from Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and a bunch of dreamers. And then in the White House, we were back at the White House watching the vote on television. The president had been making calls on both of the issues, like up until senators went to the floor for the vote. I remember Claire McCaskill had to take a really hard vote on the DREAM Act that year. She was up for re-election in 2012 and was really worried how it was going to play in her campaign, but she took the vote and supported it anyway because she knew it was the right thing to do. And I remember feeling so happy because my colleague Brian, at the time I didn't know Gautam, but was so elated because they had been working really hard to get this passed for years, even longer than the DREAM Act. And I remember feeling so deflated because I knew so many people who were in the gallery that day and had been working so hard on passing the DREAM Act. And we're sitting there and I'm literally in tears because I was like the first big loss that we had on immigration. And President Obama walks into this West Wing office that we were sitting in watching, and he sees me crying. He says, "Get over here." And he gives me this big giant hug and he says, "We're going to keep fighting." He said, "This is just a bump in the road," right? And so, and there were many moments like that, especially in immigration that we had, but like it was one of those things where it was like, we were there together to celebrate, the high moments together, but we were also there to support each other in the low moments and remind each other that it was a long road to fight and we were going to keep fighting.
I mean, there's another clear example of that, which was the day the Supreme Court ruled in Obergefell the marriage equality decision. I was at the court that morning because we knew it was coming, and it was an amazing moment to be there for that historic ruling. And then came back home with some friends, and we were just like so happy and celebrating. We put on the news, and it was the same day as the Charleston funeral service, right? So you sort of have to then snap back into remembering this is a moment of grief and loss for a community, and it's about gun violence and racial justice, and then the president sings Amazing Grace, and it's just like this powerful healing moment. And then literally an hour later, by this point I'd been out of the White House for about 2 years, my friend who had replaced me in the job as the LGBT liaison emails and says, "Come to the White House this evening, we're going to celebrate the marriage equality decision." Didn't tell us much, but they invited back everyone who worked on LGBT rights. And we were drinking champagne, and I remember Valerie had come back and she was telling us about the funeral service and what that was like and how moving it was. And then we got to be there when they lit the White House in rainbow lights. So all that happens in the course of one day, and you realize we're all like in this together. And at sometimes we win, and sometimes unfortunately we lose, and it's hard.
The 2013 reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act was a tremendous victory. Nothing was passing in Congress at that time, and it looked like VAWA was not going to pass either. And there were several key provisions that were very difficult on the Republican side. But what that fight was really about was immigration. It was really a harbinger of things to come. So it was really about the Republicans in the House trying to gut. The Violence Against Women Act had long-standing protections for women who'd been victimized or people who'd been victimized to be able to separate their immigration status from their abusive partner and pursue remedies on their own, and then to get special visas for victims of crime so that a victim of sexual assault could come forward and make a report and have an immigration remedy and not face deportation. And that's what that fight was all about. There were other stuff in it too. There was an expansion of some recognition of tribal authority to prosecute domestic violence cases against non-native offenders was a big piece of it. And then there were historic LGBTQ anti-discrimination protections in the bill. But the fight really in Congress was about immigration. It was a shot across the bow, and they worked really hard. And it was also a coming together of probably an obscure group of people you may have not heard about, but there's an activist movement called the Men's Rights Movement, and these are a group of men who are very opposed to any remedies on violence against women. And they had always been kind of on the fringe, and in 2013 they made traction on the Hill, and they joined forces with the anti-immigration people. And so they were very strong lobbyists against VAWA, and they actually got a Republican woman in the House to introduce a version of VAWA that took out all these critical immigration provisions. And not just took them out, but made them dangerous for immigrants who did come forward. So the night that bill was passing in the House, I had to draft a statement of administrative position opposing the Violence Against Women Act, which was very difficult for me to do because here was our signature piece of legislation that had now been so turned on its head by the Republicans. And I had to call Vice President Biden and tell him that. I said, I'm writing a this statement, and he said, absolutely, it's the right thing to do, and then the statement goes up, to the higher senior levels in the White House. So that was very difficult, but then we won eventually through some weird, through a lot of strong advocacy on the part of all the groups and survivors who fought really hard and eventually got the Republicans in the House to back down. And the night before the vote, there was a weird rule that was made on how the vote would proceed. So we had our good bill in the Senate and our bad bill in the House. And nobody knew exactly how it was going to work out, and the rule was presented that the House bill would be taken up and voted on, and if it failed, then the Senate bill would be taken up and voted on. And I said, this is never going to work because they have the votes to pass the House bill, so then what? But they didn't by that point. And it was really because of the strong work of the advocates. And so the House bill failed, and they took up the Senate bill, and it passed. And I was at my desk at midnight that night, and I was counting the votes, and I was on the phone with these advocates, and I was like, we just don't have the votes. And as it turned out, we did. So that was a highlight, the passage of the Violence Against Women Act, and then the signing of it, where all the Native women came, and the LGBTQ groups, and all the groups who benefited so much from the act. It was beautiful. But the worst, I think, day for me in the White House, and it's not an issue that I worked so closely on, was the Sandy Hook shootings, and the fact that we failed to be able to pass any significant legislation on gun regulation. The Obama administration and Vice President Biden was really in the lead on this, did some very important executive actions as far as our authority could go around gun regulation, but that we were not able to have any legislative victories. The day of the Sandy Hook shooting, I had a similar experience. I was going over to brief the vice president on something else, and we were watching the television in his little entryway there, and I was just sobbing, and he just came out of a meeting and just gave me a big hug, and he said, it's going to be okay. But then it wasn't. So I think that was, for me, the greatest disappointment.
Well, that was going to be the last question, but I feel like we can't end it there.
Somebody ask a happy question.
Is there a very quick happy question out there?
Sorry.
In the back.
Are any of you willing to share who you might like to see on the ticket?
Oh, who they might like to see on the ticket in 2020.
Well, you'll have to tune into Fighting 46. I think, not to put Lynn on the spot here, but I think a Biden-Harris ticket could be very cool.
Yeah.
Ah.
Co-sign, concur. I'm in it. No, seriously, I totally agree.
Can I please have a job as a speechwriter? I'm just going to ask that now.
I don't have any inside information about Joe Biden's plans. You'll find out as soon as I do. I have to say I really enjoyed Senator Klobuchar's work this week and how strong she was in her questioning. And I think it was good for people to see what a strong member of the Senate she is. And, I'm certainly in the camp of hoping for Joe Biden, but have no idea what will happen.
Well, thank you so much
Thank
for being
you guys
with us.
very much.
This has been wonderful. Everybody buy the book if you haven't already. And the keynote lunch is starting, has maybe already started, upstairs. So thank you.